Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I'm Nicholas Lovell. I'm here to talk about the curve. And the curve is trying to answer this question: how do we make money when everything is going free? And what I hear from people making apps from the book industry or the television industry or the film industry is these sort of things. You can't make money from apps. We've got to make people start valuing content again. And I deserve to be paid for my work. And I answer, yes, you can. No, you can't, and no, you don't. They don't like that last one in particular. You don't deserve to be paid for your work. You have to earn the right to be paid for your work, and that's kind of always been true, but it's even more true in a world where so much is available for free. Let's start by talking about free and where free works. Does anybody recognize that? Put your hands up, come on, don't be shy. More of you recognise that, you're just not brave. So that's Candy Crush Saga, the top grossing game on the App Store at the moment. It's totally free to start with. To start with is an important point. 70% of people who have finished all 450 levels of this really quite addictive match 3 puzzle game have never spent any money. The game is making probably $200 million a year, that's only an estimate. The first thing to point out is that free does not mean no revenues. This is a screenshot of the top grossing apps, as in the ones making the most revenue, on the iPhone from it was about 2 months ago. Candy Crush Saga was one I showed you, Clash of Clans next. Of the top 30, these are the games that are free. So 22 of the top 30 grossing products are games, and 20 of those are free games. What that means is that you have to flip your thinking. We tend to think of the internet as making things free, and free being the enemy. And I do get that, because to an extent it is the enemy. It is no longer possible to charge for the same sort of stuff that you used to charge for. So I'm going to take an example from the newspaper industry. Making a newspaper, reaching the audience with the words in a newspaper was really hard in a pre-digital age. You had to discover the news, decide what was worth writing about, write about it, edit it and sub-edit, typeset, print, and then distribute millions of copies across an entire country every morning by 6 a.m., which is a really difficult logistical challenge. I run a blog called Games Brief, which reaches 20,000 readers, all focused on the business of games. I write it in my living room, on my own. I could do it in my underpants if I wanted. I don't, sorry for giving you that image, but I could. And the point is that that's because the distribution problem that newspapers used to solve is no longer a problem. It's no longer as hard as it used to be. And actually, I believe that most of what people paid for was the solving of the distribution problem, not the content. That is no longer so hard, so it is much harder to charge for that. And the problem isn't piracy. The problem isn't an entire generation of people no longer prepared to pay for stuff. The problem is competitors figuring out a different way to take advantage of what the web has enabled. So what it has stopped is it being easy to charge for stuff because the distribution problem is no longer so difficult. It is easy to distribute stuff. It is also easy to build one-to-one relationships with your customers. And what I mean by that is that you are able to talk to your customers, to figure out what they value, and then to sell them different things at very different price points. So this is the curve. What I've done here is ranked every single person in the world, all 7 billion of us, by their preparedness to spend some money on whatever it is that you make. The bad news is that pretty well nobody wants to spend any money with what you do, but that's kind of was always the case. It's just we didn't have a chance to reach them. Maybe you used to sell an album for $10 or a video game for $40 or something along here. And you used to go, right, I have to try and target the price which maximizes the number of copies I can sell. I have clients in games with a bunch of customers, individuals who spent more than $10,000 on a single game. We'll talk a bit more about Kickstarter, but if you want to see an example of the curve in action, look at successful crowdfunded campaigns, where we see again and again that there are superfans who will pay 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times the average to support their creator, the band, the game maker, the author, the novelist, the poet, or whatever. So I see what the curve says is that the web, this free thing, this threat to the way which we've always made money in the 20th century, is a marketing opportunity. And you should embrace that, because if you don't, your competition will. So you have to start figuring out how to find the people who will spend 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times the average. And that's what I call the curve, which comes in 3 parts. You have to find an audience. You have to use technology to figure out what they value, and most importantly, to be able to talk to them again. And you have to enable superfans. For most of us brought up in 20th century thinking, a free customer is somebody who we are trying to convert, and that's perfectly valid. But that is a little bit like thinking of free customers as being basically one very tiny step above pirates. We don't like them, we don't love them, we don't embrace them. And freeloaders have 4 very, very important roles. The first one, if you're a volume business, is you can sell ads to them, so a very classic process. The second one is word of mouth. Amongst the mothers of young children that I know, Candy Crush Saga is incredibly popular because they're all playing it, they're all talking about it, and even if they're not, they're all sharing it with each other on Facebook because the game is plugged very tightly into Facebook. They're all potential converts, and I do stick with that convert point. I'm a sailor, and a while back I was preparing for a big sailing trip. I went to a now defunct chandlery on Piccadilly, and I was following around the shop this guy who was wearing a really dirty black T-shirt, and he had a bottle of Evian or Volvic or something full of a thick black sludge, and every so often he'd take the lid off and spit from his quid of chewing tobacco into the top of it and seal it up. And I would have kicked him out of the shop, and he took out a black Amex and spent 20,000 quid in front of me, and I'd have got that wrong. And you never know who your best customers are going to be. And when it doesn't cost you anything to service them, because in this world of free or almost free digital distribution, you can often service these customers for almost no cost. It makes no sense to kick people out when you don't yet know if they're going to be your best customer. But there's a 4th role, which is really, really important, and that's the role of gawkers. The artist trying to sell a $300 limited edition of his product is best served by having millions of people knowing that he exists, so that when somebody walks through the door and sees a $300 version, they go, oh, cool, you've got the $300 version of that thing. That is one way of embracing the gawkers. So gawkers really matter. I mean, we've always known this. I'm sure that the engineers at Ferrari could have made their cars quieter and less yellow. But one of the things they're selling is that people's heads turn when you drive past, and that matters. So you have to love your freeloaders. They matter. But you do need to be able to make money. And that's where I think technology comes in. And I think there are 2 things you need to use tech for in this digital age. The first one is to understand what your audience values. I dislike focus groups when increasingly we can actually just watch what people actually do rather than what they say they will do. Also, you can just put something up and see if there is a demand. I have one book which we're working on now where I announced it on my blog and said, hey, sign up to get it. And when they signed up, we went, actually, we haven't written it yet, but we wanted to know if anybody wanted it. And now we've got your email address. Thank you very much. We'll send you an email when it's ready. Again, not a new idea. In the early 1980s, back when video games could be written in 6 weeks, one of the video game companies took out 4 ads in a magazine for games, none of which existed. And the one which got the most postcards, it was 1980s back in, saying, I'd like to buy this game, please, was the one they made and released. It's not a new idea. It's a very lean startup idea. But this is the second bit, earn the right to talk to them again. So you use tech, figure out what they want, be able to talk to them again. And then you have to enable the superfans. And the superfans are really, really important. And this is my sentence, which I will repeat a lot from here on in. Let those who love what you do spend lots of money on things they truly value. So if you want to build an enduring business, you have to build a relationship with your customers that has some meaning. You need to enable them to spend lots of money. In a pre-digital world, if you said, I have 1 million customers, 1 million people bought my album, I've made $10 million, you can be reasonably confident that most people spent about $10. In the old world, you sold a thing for $10 and 100% of people paid $10. In the new world, 90% of people are getting that thing for free. If you want to make the same amount of money, the remaining 10% have to spend an average of $100. And you've got to start figuring out what it is that they might value. The problem is not in this free world reaching them, it's making them care. There is so much free stuff out there that why do they care about your stuff? In my world of games, we're now spending an average of $2 to acquire a free customer, i.e. we are spending $2 to get somebody who doesn't spend any money with us because the competition is so intense, because we have people spending tens of thousands of dollars with us at the other end of the curve, which means that you have to create stuff that they actually value to build a long-term relationship. So, I'm not sure you're going to recognize this in this audience. Anybody recognize who that is? Anybody? He's a video game guy. He's called Tim Schafer, and he made video games in the 1990s, which were kind of cerebral point-and-click adventures. And then the video game industry discovered shooting people in the head, and Call of Duty became really popular. And the kind of thoughtful games that he made, publishers turned around and said, nobody wants your games anymore. And then the internet and direct distribution came along, and Tim Schafer went, well, maybe there is an audience of people who want my stuff. Wouldn't it be great if there's a way that I could ask them to give me money to make the kind of stuff that I think they want? And luckily for him, Kickstarter and similar crowdfunding sites existed. And for those of you who don't know Kickstarter, it's a thing where a creator turns up and says, I want to make this thing. Will you give me money to make this thing? And when I've made this thing, I'll give it to you. But they typically have a whole bunch of different tiers and different ways you can participate. So Tim announced a new point-and-click adventure, and he said, I'm going to make one. He didn't say very much about it. It's going to be a game by me of the kind you like, but he had a big brand following. And for $15, you could get the game when it's finished. For $30, you get the game and the documentary which was being made. For $100, you get a special edition box, which is the game and the documentary and a T-shirt and a physical book. That was great value if you were a big fan and collector. For $500, you got all of that stuff. What was the bit of the $1,000? You got a mini portrait of you painted by the game's artist in the style of the game. And for $5,000, you got an original piece of art from the video game. For $10,000, you could fly to San Francisco at your own cost and have lunch with Tim. That sold out really, really quickly. At one of these talks, I found one of the 4 people, and I asked people how much they spent on this. One person had their hand up at $10,000. So I have found that person once. So he wanted to make $400,000 from this campaign. He got there in a day. He made $3.3 million in the month, and 87,000 people backed him for an average pledge of $38, which is a bit expensive for a PC game, but about what you would expect. But I've explained to you already, I hope you already grasped that averages are misleading in this world. So this is the analysis of the number of people who backed him at those different tiers. So out of the 87,000 people, 48,000 people backed the $15, a lot of people at $30. There's a spike at this $100 one, which I said was good value, 11,000 people. And then after that, you go, whatever, tiny numbers. But when you look at it by revenue rather than by pledges, it looks very, very different. This big group here is now only 20% of the audience. They look like your audience. Turns out they're not terribly important. That second spike, turns out, is a third of the money, were those not even super fans, medium fans. These people up here, these numbers are starting to get quite meaningful. And I did another piece of analysis, and I went, right, of the 3.3 million, the people who spent more than $1,000 or more were 0.1% of the audience, enough that you'd barely have paid attention to them before, 6% of the money. People who spent $250 or more, 1% of the audience, but 15% of the money. And this one, $100 or more, 15% of the audience, 50% of the revenue. So more than half of the revenue came from a sort of Pareto 80-20 rule, the 15% of the people who love this a lot. And in crowdfunding campaigns, we see that again and again. In successful campaigns, the people, about 15 to 20% of the audience, of the spenders, the people, are 50 to 75% of the revenue, again and again. And what that means is that the reason why you should go and look at crowdfunding sites is not because they are eliminating the publishers. They can do that, but it's not the only thing. It's because they're the most visible way of seeing what people will spend on, with numbers attached. Often when talking about crowdfunding on the web, people talk about the musician Amanda Palmer, who raised $1 million to fund the creation of her next album from her fans. And her $10,000 tier was not have lunch with me. It was, I will come to your house and paint you naked. Wasn't entirely clear who was naked in that particular process. $10,000 for that. Now, she put up, there will be 10 of these, and only 2 people bought them, making her $20,000. But it didn't cost her anything to try if that was important. She was enabled to test what superfans want. And while I said I might provide you answers, what I basically mean is whatever your industry is, go and look at crowdfunding campaigns and see what other people are doing, because they've already done it, and go and experiment. So far, however, it seems as if this is a purely digital idea. So I want to wrap up by talking about the least digital product which I could think of, which is flour. Flour is not going to be disrupted by the digital age. And yet King Arthur Flour has grown from being the 5th largest miller in the States to the 2nd largest through a curve strategy. So at the free end, it has a YouTube channel. It has videos of how-to guides. It's got how to measure a cup of flour. I don't know if there are any Americans in the room. I've never understood the cup measure. But it turns out if you measure a cup badly, you can get 20% more flour than you expected in your cup, which mucks up your choux pastry recipe completely. So 60,000 views for a video, 1-minute video of how to measure a cup of flour. On their website, they've got recipes and how-to guides. They have a phone helpline, which you can call up and talk to a friendly baker who will explain to you how to rescue the choux pastry, which you've just stuffed up because you didn't watch the video. They sell flour in supermarkets, as you would expect. They sell recipe books. They sell rolling pins. I was surprised to discover that rolling pins are more expensive than recipe books, but they are. For $400-500, superfans travel to their Vermont headquarters and learn how to bake choux pastry or gluten-free bread or make the perfect croissant. And then each of these people goes back into the towns and villages across the states, ambassadors kind of dropping like bombs into different villages saying, hey, you know your way around baking, their friends say. And you go, yeah, I learned it all from King Arthur Flour. So it's kind of a strategy that goes, this is the product. Anybody else would just be trying to figure out how to sell more of this. And this is a business which has grown from 5 people to 297 people, revenues approaching very, very close to $100 million last year from embracing a curve strategy. And along this process, they earned the ability to speak to people again, which is how they were able to move people up the curve. So to finish, you have to love your freeloaders. You don't know which ones of them are going to be valuable. It doesn't cost you very much to serve them, and they have value even if they never spend money, as gawkers, as word of mouth, as context for people's spend. You need to love your superfans. We do need to get our revenue from somewhere, and these are the people who love what you do, enough to spend more than they used to with you, because you're getting all of the other stuff they used to have to pay for free. And you need to love everybody in between. These aren't binary categories. It's a journey, it's a continuum, it's a curve. So love your freeloaders. Love your superfans, love everyone in between. I love you all. Thank you very much.
At what point does this sort of curve strategy maybe become counterproductive? In this case, online gaming.
Yep.
You know, get in free, start playing, microtransactions that build throughout the game. There's a point at which that has become so ubiquitous as a strategy now, obviously for good reason, as you say, that it's starting to kind of corrode the value that people want to get from the gaming experience. Because I think one person said, games don't feel like art anymore. They're just business experiments with sloppy storylines and fancy graphics. They become like slot machines.
I love the idea that games aren't art anymore. That's brilliant, because we've been arguing that games are art for ages. Now it turns out that they were art all along, and now they're not. So that's a win. But there is also a valid and viable criticism, which goes, we get people in, we train them in Skinner box, operant conditioning, psychological techniques, which are very similar to slot machine stuff, and people just keep pulling the slots, and the game is just an aggressive money-making machine. And I think that criticism has some validity. There are several problems. The first is that we're not rats and pigeons, and operant conditioning behavior works on rats and pigeons, and it works on a few humans, which is why the gambling industry still exists, but it doesn't work on everybody, not by a long way. The games industry is particularly polarizing. There is a small group of minority gamers who hate this change to their industry. There's also a meaningful group of games which are at the exploitative end of the psychological spectrum. Those ones aren't continuing. I mean, we're just seeing it getting harder and harder for those things to happen.
I'd be interested to hear your views on how this can help political parties, and does that interest you in general, the political element of it?
If you take the bits, use free to find an audience, use technology to figure out what they want, enable superfans. All of those things can exist in the political sphere. So whether the free stuff is, write your MP and that really easy boilerplate, as a result, low value kind of engagement, through to figuring out which people actually care about issues and being able to move from an era of tribal allegiance to parties to responsive allegiance to issues. The superfan in a political sense is about time, not money. So it's about who's prepared to commit time to you